greatest of right now. Wilder, Fury 2, here we go.
Okay, we'll start with this per tweet from Michael Benson. Ryan Garcia had this to say. He says, "I'm on one mission to knock out Javonte Davis in 2 rounds. 2 rounds. Javonte, if you do not take this next fight with me, you will not be remembered. Your legacy will forever be tainted. The money's there. Everything's there. No excuses." To which Javonte Davis replied, "LOL, when I ever been a bitch? You know who you talked to 10 minutes before your ring walk. The fight's already been made. Now shut up and get ready." It's important to note that this tweet from Javonte Davis, this reply, it has since been deleted.
Uh-oh.
But better still, this is what the talk was.
These 2 guys supposed to be fighting next?
I mean, at least that's the look of it. We know that Oscar De La Hoya, he's been quite vocal about the fight, asking Floyd Mayweather Jr. outright by way of social media as to whether or not they'd be willing to make that fight next.
Are you down?
The impression that all of these public statements by way of social media, the impression they leave me with is to take what I'm seeing with a grain of salt, because whatever is being put out there could very well be being put out there so that people see it, so that they react to it.
What if these guys are putting on a show?
What if both teams have been corresponding with each other in order to make a fight between Ryan, between Javonte? What if this is what they've been doing, but
It's not going to be next.
what if what all of this is
The beginning.
both teams using social media as a tool to test the waters and see what kind of response the mere proposition of the fight, what response that gets? Because I'm going to stay an old cynic.
A skeptic.
It's going to take more than an exchange on Twitter to convince me that these 2 guys are going to be fighting each other next. We've seen a lot of back and forth action by way of social media the last couple of years.
We have.
And these Twitter wars, as many of them as there have been, these Twitter wars don't always result in a fight.
As a matter of fact, they don't often result in a fight.
Regardless of what's being said and who's saying it. I mean, Danny Garcia and Terrence Crawford, they had a Twitter war that went on for a long time, but at the end of the day, those 2 guys never fought.
Javonte Davis has had quite a few Twitter wars himself.
The vast majority of them didn't result in a fight, so you'll excuse me for maintaining a healthy level of skepticism in reference to this proposition that the next time we see Ryan and Javonte, it's going to be them fighting each other. You'll excuse me if I'm not quite sold on that.
I gotta see it to believe it.
Because what I'd sooner believe is that maybe these are the beginning stages, the preliminary stages of what could be the promotion for a Ryan Garcia versus Javonte Davis fight. This could be that, but this could be that with the intention of having those 2 fighters have at least one more fight before they face each other. I still think there's a good chance Javonte Davis locks horns with Gary Russell Jr. at 130 pounds, and I still think there's a good chance that Ryan Garcia fights the likes of a Jorge Linares before he fights Javonte Davis.
I don't think this fight with Javonte and Ryan happens for at least another 2 fights.
I would love to be wrong about this. I would love to see the fight sooner than later. But want doesn't always get, especially in the sport of boxing.
Yeah, some things are just too good to be true.
As careful as Javonte Davis's handlers have been with him the last couple of years, I just don't get the sense that they'd throw him into a situation like this one, a sizable situation where there are some risks involved. Javonte Davis, who's only had 1 fight as a bona fide lightweight, rather unimpressive showing against Yuriorkis Gamboa. Said this before and I'll say it again. The Golden Boy Promotions, I think they like a Javonte Davis fight more than they like a Devin Haney fight. And you can forget about a Teofimo Lopez fight. I don't think they want to put Ryan in there with that guy anytime in the near future. Out of those guys, out of those 3 kids, out of those 3 options, I think the people at Golden Boy like Javonte Davis the best. In turn, I think the people at Mayweather Promotions, in reference to Javonte, I don't think they have any intention of putting him in there with Teofimo.
No.
I I don't think they have any intention of putting him in there with Devin Haney. If they are going to put him in there with someone in the near future, I do think it'll be Ryan. I'm just not convinced that's going to be next. I think they have, perhaps started working on the fight, talking about it, but I really don't imagine this is what's going to be next. And I reiterate, I'd love to be wrong about this, but if you've been watching the sport of boxing as long as I've been watching the sport of boxing...
You don't count your chickens before they're hatched.
You don't get your hopes up off of every little bit of news you come across.
Ultimately, I'll believe it when I see it.
In other news, up-and-coming Puerto Rican super middleweight sensation Edgar Berlanga wants Gabe Rosado now, David Benavidez much later. Sounds like a sound plan, sounds like sound logic to me. Given how Gabe Rosado looked against Daniel Jacobs, that he really gave him a run for his money, that the fight was a lot more competitive than people thought it was going to be, a lot more competitive perhaps than it should have been, given Daniel Jacobs' championship experiences with fighters like Quillen, Gennady Golovkin, Canelo Alvarez, Sergey Dedevianchenko. I mean, you would have expected that
Danny would have looked alive.
Edgar Berlanga has amassed a rather impressive string of knockouts in what are the early stages of his career. He's a banger. He's an artillery guy. That's what he is. And the reason that a Gabriel Rosado fight makes a lot of sense is because Gabriel Rosado has a unique ability of slowing down a fight, that if things aren't going Gabriel Rosado's way...
That's what'll happen.
By now, I don't think I need to tell you the kind of fighters that Gabriel Rosado has shared the ring with, the kind of experience that he brings to the table. He's a tough guy. He's not going to crumble off the first hard shot that lands, and that's what makes him an adequate litmus test for an artillery guy like Edgar Berlanga.
See how big a puncher he is or how big a puncher he ain't.
I'll tell you what I think. This is the ideal fight to stage the week of the Puerto Rican Day Parade in New York City.
Wepa.
This is the ideal fight for Edgar Berlanga to make a statement against Gabriel Rosado, given how Gabriel Rosado just made Daniel Jacobs look. A much more experienced guy than Edgar, wouldn't you say?
I think the fight makes a lot of sense.
Edgar is one of several fighters managed by the Havoc Advisory. Talked about in passing here on the channel several times, also featuring fighters like Melissa Odessa.
Bring IQ's 2020 Prospect of the Year.
It's a very talented, young, up-and-coming group of fighters that could very well make waves that reverberate throughout the boxing cosmos for years to come. And I think this is the next chapter, what should be the next chapter in young Edgar's career, who seems to exhibit a lot of star power for what in many ways is an unproven prospect. I don't see a lot of things getting in the way of this fight, I don't see any reason that this fight shouldn't happen. I imagine that Gabriel Rosado is going to want a sizable amount of money to
fight Edgar,
participate in this thing, but nothing exorbitant.
Nothing that'll stop the fight from happening.
This is a fight that I think is going to take place later on this year, once the spring and summer months roll around, and I'm looking forward to that. In other news, per tweet from Michael Benson, Canelo Alvarez on Gennady Golovkin, I don't have to prove anything to anyone. I did my job already by beating him twice. I feel like I'm at my peak. If it happens a third time, I feel so good that I most likely knock him out and do some serious damage. I think Canelo Alvarez's recollection of the first fight is grown a bit hazy as, he didn't get the decision. He didn't get the nod in the first fight. What he did get was a draw. A lot of people, myself included, feel that he was lucky to get that. Because I didn't have it a draw on my card. Better still, Canelo Alvarez went on to discuss his immediate future, and he said, it's a pretty simple plan for 2021. Fight for all the belts at 168 pounds, and fight 3 times, maybe 4. My goal is to fight anyone at 168 pounds if they have a title. That's who I'm going to go after. February, May, and September. That's our goal for 2021.
It'd really be something if he fought 3 times this year.
No, this isn't like previous eras of boxing to where a fighter of Canelo Alvarez's stature makes, more than just 1 or 2 ring appearances per year. That used to be normal. That used to be normalcy way back when, previous eras.
It used to be.
Where the biggest name in the sport makes more than just 1 or 2 ring appearances annually. These days, someone of Canelo Alvarez's stature, they don't get out there but so much per year because they make so much money, they don't really have to.
They'll have like 2 fights, the max.
Canelo Alvarez is making quite a few public statements as of late, and those statements paint a picture to where, maybe he doesn't have that third Golovkin fight. I still think the people at the Zone want to deliver that fight. I still think they look at that fight as a premium fight for their platform. Perhaps they are still interested in staging it, but Canelo Alvarez just isn't as interested in having it. He wants to become the super middleweight division's undisputed champion. It's for this reason that he fought for the actual WBC title at the weight. He wasn't satisfied just being a French fry champion. He wanted the full title, the world title, the version of it you need in order to become an undisputed champion. The one that comes with mandatories. Mandatories like the one he's about to satisfy in Avni Yildirim.
There's a reason Canelo Alvarez chose to do this.
There is a reason he so decided to shoot for the WBC's world title, that version of it having already been crowned their franchise champion. Canelo Alvarez, in his heart of hearts, knows that that designation don't mean nothing. It's got no lineage, no history behind it. And so long as there's some other guy running around with a full version of the green belt, full version of the world title, there is dispute. Thus, he cannot become undisputed until he collects that version of the title. And that's what he did. We know what Canelo Alvarez is set to be doing for at least the next 2 fights. Avni Yildirim, then a potential unification match with Billy Joe Saunders. The future for Gennady Golovkin is a little bit more topsy-turvy, a little bit more immaterial. You know, we heard Eddie Hearn very recently talk about proposing to the higher-ups at the zone that Gennady and Demetrius Andrade fight in a unification match between them. But very recently, news broke that Canelo Alvarez has finally vacated the middleweight version of the WBA title.
Now that he holds the super middleweight version.
That essentially makes Ryota Murata the WBA's full-fledged champion at 160 pounds. And that could lead to a Gennady Golovkin Ryota Murata unification match. That's a genuine possibility. Ryota Murata, much like Jaime Munguia, is a potential opponent option that the Gennady Golovkin people had reviewed before. You know, we know that a long time ago they wanted to fight Jaime Munguia. We also know that the Nevada State Athletic Commission would not approve that fight at that time. A lot has happened since then. But along with Jaime Munguia, they were throwing around the idea that maybe Gennady Golovkin can fight with Ryota Murata as well. And I think either of those two opponent options are more likely to come into fruition. Those fights are more likely to happen than a Demetrius Andrade unification match.
Because a fight with Andrade don't move the needle.
That's what it all really boils down to. And that is without condoning or condemning. I'm all for unification matches whenever they can happen. I am not against a Gennady Golovkin versus Demetrius Andrade fight. But if we're going to try to forecast what Gennady Golovkin is more likely to do, what opponent he is more likely to choose, I'd sooner believe he fights Munguia before he fights Demetrius. I'd sooner believe he fights Ryota Murata before he fights Demetrius.
I don't think Gennady Golovkin wants anything to do with that guy.
I just don't. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. I've never seen Gennady Golovkin.
Never once.
At all. Expressed any interest whatsoever in fighting Demetrius Andrade under any circumstances. I've just never seen it. And here in 2021, that hasn't changed. A fight between Gennady Golovkin and Demetrius Andrade here stateside. I don't imagine that fight gets much of a reception. I think that the hardcores like me and you, of course, will tune in, but the casual observer, you know, they don't follow Demetrius Andrade. They don't know a lot about that guy. If you compare what Gennady Golovkin could do with, say, Jaime Munguia, Cinco de Mayo, somewhere in the Southwest, well, that does change things considerably. I dare say he'd get an even bigger reception than that, fighting Ryota Murata over there in the Far East in Japan. You have to understand, Ryota Murata by himself gets monster viewership, brings in monster ratings in the Far East, in the land of the rising sun. Add the name of Gennady Golovkin to the mix, and what you have is a whale of a fight, a super fight. They were looking at that guy before, well over a year ago, and they might be looking at that guy again here and now, because here and now, for all accounts, Ryota Murata is the full-fledged WBA middleweight champion, at least until further notice. So who says Gennady Golovkin doesn't have a unification fight with that guy? It could happen. And if it does, what becomes of Demetrius? What becomes of the WBO's reigning middleweight champion? Well, one guy, at least one guy that seems interested in fighting him, Liam Williams, his mandatory challenger by way of the WBO, he recently took to Twitter and said, just putting it out there now, that bitch, Boo Boo Andrade, will not fight me. He will vacate the title, and I'll have to bash that stiff Jaime Munguia. To which a random Twitter follower replied, is he not in agreement for a Golovkin fight?
What?
Don't even know. Just know he don't want to fight me because he will be dealt with. And I'm not sure where those comments are coming from. I'm not sure if that's some sort of an insight into a failed set of negotiations between the Liam Williams people and the Demetrius Andrade people, or is this just Liam talking a lot of shit? I'm not sure. But I'll tell you something, that Demetrius Andrade is not in a position to ignore this guy, because the truth of it is, he's not going to get a Canelo fight. He's not. He's not going to get a Golovkin fight either. He's not going to get a Charlo fight.
He's not.
And given that Canelo Alvarez means to unify titles with Billy Joe Saunders in the very near future, going into 2021, I doubt that Demetrius gets a fight with that guy.
With Billy.
For a little while there, it looked like there was something going on between Demetrius and Billy, but that was before Canelo Alvarez so decided to target Billy Joe Saunders for a unification match in May of this year. Billy Joe Saunders ain't gonna take no chances with no Demetrius Andrade if he knows that a Canelo Alvarez fight is right around the corner. So that, once again, leaves Demetrius Andrade looking for a dance partner. So who better to satisfy than his mandatory challenger, Liam Williams? At this point, Demetrius Andrade is just not in a position to ignore any call-outs, because there are many fight fans out there who are happy to watch him fall through the cracks. Canelo's got several options, you know? He's got the Avni Yildirim fight coming up, and then after that, he's got the Billy Joe Saunders fight. We just talked about what's on the table for Gennady Golovkin.
He's got options.
He's got Jaime Munguia, and he's got Ryota Murata to consider. Jermall Charlo, you can forget about Jermall Charlo. They already tried it with that guy, and at minimum, Jermall Charlo at least has Chris Eubank Jr. as a potential opponent option. But what's Demetrius got? What's he supposed to do? Who's he supposed to fight?
Maybe he can move up in weight.
So if he did, he would in effect be vacating his WBO middleweight title. If he so decided to move up to super middleweight here and now, he wouldn't be a champion anymore. Does that really put him in a pole position to get big fights?
No.
A lot of these guys, they weren't interested in you when you had a belt. You think not having a belt is going to make you more interesting?
No.
The guy's in a rough spot because none of the big names seem to want anything to do with him. For whatever reason, they just don't. And you know, Liam Williams, he's calling you out. He's your mandatory challenger. He seems really excited. Might as well fight that guy.
Because how's it going to look if he doesn't?
You've got one guy targeting you, one guy calling you out. And this is the guy that you don't fight? You decide to go the other way?
I don't think he'd be doing himself any favors if he did that.
He should fight Liam Williams.